Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of our English 5795 online course. It is a beautiful fall day here today, and I am really excited to get into the content of this week, where we're turning our attention from some of the ecologies that surround education, school, and after that, we had looked at ecologies of events, timely spaces, temporary art, etc. And last week we were introduced to the concept, or maybe it was review for some of you. We came to the concept of kairos. And this week we're going to be thinking about kairos as it relates to sacred spaces. So we're turning to yet another ecological set of spaces and experiences. And in our readings this week, I hope that we're going to get a broad sense of what sacred means for different faith practices. So you might encounter something in the reading that feels very familiar to you, or the opposite. Maybe you're going to encounter stuff in the readings that feels very unfamiliar to you. And that's by design. I understand not all of us are coming from a faith practice at all or the same faith practices. So I hope that we can come to these readings with an open mind and think about some of the themes of our course: rhetoric of space, place, thinking about how meaning is made in spaces. And this week, it's the context of the sacred or faith-based practices. So I'm going to head over to our Canvas view and look at our assignments for the week, and then we'll jump into our mini lecture. Okay, so here we are in our Canvas view. Look at how much we have accomplished so far. We are 5 weeks in, people. Down here in week 5, you can see all of the readings are posted here. You'll notice there is a bonus read this week. So again, that's a reading that's not required, but if you're really into what we're talking about and want to read yet another presentation of this from a different point of view, please check that out. We've got one reading response due this week and one reflective discussion. So kind of a standard week in terms of the work. What you need to watch this week is, as usual, your instructor video, which you're doing, so Air 5. The readings include the Sur Sistema reading, Crosby and Sani, and then, of course, the bonus read by Metzger and Katz. Write your reading response, your reflective discussion. You can see how we tend to spread things out across the week, starting with your instructor video on Wednesday-ish, and then getting into your reading response by Friday, in order that you can participate in the reflective discussion by Sunday. And then also there's a note here that just as we're continuing to think about these different aspects of writing ecologies and spatial ecologies, think about your writing ecology map. You guys already turned in the draft of that. I'm still working through them, so I apologize that it's taken me a while to get feedback back to you. But be thinking about if there's anything that you want to add to your writing ecology map this week. All right, now without further ado, I'm going to hop over to our mini lecture. I did that all on screen, so I hope it worked out okay. But this week we're talking about writing into and out of faith communities, and I'm going to kick it off by presenting you guys with your reflective prompts for the week. Question 1. How do faith communities inhabit and sacralize spaces? So by faith communities, I'm referring to the people, the humans who participate in a given faith practice. How do they inhabit and sacralize a space? And as you read through all of our readings from this week, you'll see that is a very complicated and diverse answer. There's lots of different ways that people can inhabit and sacralize spaces. Question 2. What are the spatial tensions between faith communities and other discourse communities, embodied communities, material, political? So that's another reflective prompt that will hopefully help you engage with readings as well. Okay, so we're going to start talking about these readings probably from the outside working in terms of methodologies. In terms of content, all of this is fascinating and incredibly relevant. This first article, the Sur Sistema article about In Light of Reverence, is interesting because the methodology is not something that we're going to really tackle in this course, but you may see this type of methodology pop up in other courses that you take, especially if you're thinking about rhetorical analysis or new media of any kind. Because what's happening in this article, this paper, is an analysis of a video, a documentary, the documentary In the Light of Reverence, which I gather you can access on PBS. Hopefully you could just find it online. But in this article, Sur Sistema is going to be analyzing the types of discourse present in the documentary. So if you're tracking, we're 2 levels deep in Inception terms. So the discourse in the documentary analyzed by Sur Sistema. And what I think is really important is that here what we're seeing is the ways that Native peoples in the United States are trying to engage the United States in discourse about their rights to their own sacred lands. So that's really the crux of this article. There's this juxtaposition of Native frameworks around responsibility, right? So the imperative that there is a responsibility to the land that the tribes are trying to enact and inhabit, versus the political discourse around rights, which, as you see in the article and in the documentary, is not always a very effective track for Native peoples to follow. Oftentimes that discourse of rights gets used against them as much as they can find purchase there. Versus the discourse of destruction. What exactly is being destroyed here is the question that can so often get twisted. But I think that it's really interesting to think about responsibility as a rhetorical device, because this is something that pops up a lot in rhetorical literature. So responsibility as a habit of mind, as a rhetorical frame, and here as a rhetorical device that the tribes are using. But they need to use a multi-pronged approach for it to be successful, is the argument, that paired with a discourse around reverence or legitimacy, so pulling in the sacred and that rights-based discourse is what, perhaps combined with the discourse of responsibility, brings about the best results. But I think it's really key here that Sur Sistema is not going to generalize. The term sacred spaces is used, but with the caveat that this means different things to different tribes, and that it really needs to be taken on a relational basis. What is a sacred space to, say, the Lakota people versus the Hopi people or the Wintu people? We can't overgeneralize and homogenize that term to apply across tribal particularities. So that distinctiveness, highlighting that, also is an argument against cultural appropriation, in the sense that because we can't overgeneralize, it has to be so particular and specific to a given tribe, and that requires relationship to fully understand. So the conversation around rights as a rhetorical device versus responsibility as a rhetorical device is really the main theme of this article, as the term Native American brings together two seemingly disparate terms, a Native person who's also an American. So this is something to think about in terms of definitions of sacred space, how various individuals might perceive that space, how meaning is made. I think it's particularly interesting when we get to the example of the Wintu people who are protesting New Age ceremonies being conducted on their own land. So that's sort of like a juxtaposition of two different spiritual practices or faith practices. And then we're going to keep the focus on this article in that realm, because the methodology of looking at a film and analyzing discourse that's occurring in a film is not something that we're really going to use for our project later on in the semester. Now, we kind of get into a transitional article here. Crosby is really going to present us with a lot to sink our teeth into around the idea of kairos. So this is an article applying kairos to a sacred space. But it's kind of a loaded sacred space because Crosby is looking at the National Cathedral of the United States. Excuse me, you'll see Crosby applying kairos to the cathedral as the object of analysis here, which is, again, loaded, and we kind of see that as he comes to the discussion. But I think what's really important for us, for the purposes of our class, is to see how kairos is applied to a place of worship or sacred space. So Crosby defines and delineates between sacred kairos. So this is, from that passage that he pulls from Genesis, sacred kairos would be resisting a linkage to time and creating a sort of enduring quality that exists outside of time because of its connection to supernatural or divine ordinances. Spatial kairos, which is connected to what Rickard presented us with in ambient kairos, or emplaced kairos, in his book Ambient Rhetoric. Spatial kairos is attempting to capture that sense of meaning and the transcendence of sacred kairos, but pushing it into a literal physical space, not just a metaphorical space or a dream space, if that makes sense. So this is contrasting with a rational kairos that might really be dependent on sort of that ancient Greek definition of this is opportunity, you need to seize it. It's very time-based. So there's a lot of contrasting in terms of the usages of this term going on in this article. I think that this is a really interesting quote here. All sacred spaces share a common goal of merging heaven and earth, but they do so in culturally unique ways. And I think that quote was so interesting because it kind of reaches out to the other articles and chapters that we're looking at this week. Then we move on to Sani, and I got really excited when I came across this article over the summer because this is using the methodology that we are going to use in our project at the end of the semester, or in the second half of the semester, I should say. So Sani is using ethnography as the method of inquiry to explore how space is transformed physically and in terms of meaning by the sacred acts that occur in the space. So the key question here that Sani's asking is, how is space made meaningful? And in particular, how is it made meaningful for folks who are practicing their faith in a particular way? And so here's another great quote. When religious groups inhabit these spaces, and referring to any space, but particularly a temporary space, they transform the spaces in ways that generate a qualitatively different sense of being in the space. right? So this is hearkening back to what Crosby is saying, and indeed what happens as we look at some of the discourse practices around sacred spaces for Native tribes, that because folks are worshiping in a space, it transforms it into a sacred space and changes it qualitatively for anyone present, even if they're not worshipers. So this is thinking about Kairos, but not explicitly, right? The Kairos here is in the space itself because the ethnographic observations are happening in a temporary space that's being used for this particular worshipful purpose, but is not all. This space isn't always given over to this kind of worship, if that makes sense. So this is a contrast from the National Cathedral, say, and actually maybe has more connection to the sacred spaces of the various tribes from the first article. So lots of opportunities for connections and synthesis across all these readings this week. Man, I feel like I could keep going, but I'm going to rein us in here and pull back to our full view and close out our video for this week. Okay. Lots to think about, lots of really interesting ways that our readings can overlap, create connections, spin off into new directions. So I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with in your reading responses and indeed in your reflective discussions as you kind of share your insights with each other. Of course, I'm a nerd about this, so I'm like so jazzed by all of the cool things that there are to possibly talk about. And we couldn't possibly get to them all. But I hope that this week, as you're reading, as you're writing through ideas, as you're connecting with your classmates in the discussion, that you can feel some of that generative power as we are connecting ideas across weeks and across readings. What I'm trying to say is that this is fun, isn't it? This is so fun. All right. So I'm excited to read through your stuff this week. If you have any questions, of course, please contact me via email. I've had some great conferences with folks via Zoom and in my office. So make sure you avail yourself of all the supports that are going on for this class. Otherwise, happy reading, happy thinking, and happy writing. I'll see you guys in next week's video. Bye, everybody.